Hihani washte, the Maka Ganaji Machapilla, Oyufe, and Mataha. I'm Maka Clifford. Good morning. In fact, that's the first thing I would like to talk to you about today. Is I would like to teach you something. I would like to teach you this phrase, Hihani washte. So why don't you repeat it after me. First we'll do Hihani.
Hihani.
Yeah, Hihani.
Hihani.
Washte.
Washte.
Hihani washte.
Hihani washte.
Very good. Excellent. Now you can walk away from this keynote saying you've learned something. Hihani washte, it means good morning, right? Hihani means morning. Washte means good. And to me, this is an example, a little mini example of what I think my whole presentation is going to be about this morning. Yesterday was an amazing day. We heard from so many wonderful linguists who are doing such amazing work, certainly standing on the shoulders of giants in that regard. I'm not a linguist. I am just an educator. Not just. I'm an educator. I work in American Indian schools. Particularly, I work on the Pine Ridge Reservation, working with Red Cloud Indian School. And I'll talk a little bit about that today as well. Just a little bit in the introduction here. So this is Red Cloud. This is kind of a little bit of a snapshot of who we are. We're a Jesuit K through 12 institution. In fact, we're the only Jesuit school that operates on an Indian reservation. So we're pretty excited about that. We love being, having that as part of our identity. We also belong to the American Indian Catholic Schools Network. So that's one of the memberships that we have. And in terms of our work in Lakota language revitalization, we actually worked with Indiana University. I know they had some folks here yesterday who to work on building a K through 12 Lakota language curriculum built right within our system. Eventually, people broke off from that and formed their own private entity, but we still work with Indiana University to make sure that that's something we build, that the curriculum is within our organization. And we also work with a local nonprofit to implement more immersion programs. So we actually there's an immersion daycare on the reservation, and when those daycare students have hit kindergarten age, the nonprofit that we work with called, well, suddenly I've lost the name of that nonprofit. I'll remember it later. But they hit school age, and they didn't know what to do with those students. So Red Cloud said, why don't you have them come here, and we'll continue the immersion process, right? So that is something we're very excited in. Our immersion students are now in 2nd grade, so that's super exciting to continue to build that curriculum working with Thunder Valley Corporation. That is the name of the nonprofit. So that's a little bit about Red Cloud Indian School and who I work with and what I do. I'm also the director of curriculum for the institution. So in my first year of doing that, so I work with all of our teachers, including our language teachers, on building what we do and how we reach our students. But what I'm really here to talk about today is, and to start us off this morning, is just kind of about how Indigenous schooling is thought about and what Indigenous schooling looks like and what we mean when we say that. And I'm going to go back to our example this morning of Hihani washte, right? What does it mean? Good morning. How do you say it? Excellent, good job. So this is an expression we use all the time in our curriculum, right? It's clearly a direct correlation to the English phrase, good morning. I am not a fluent speaker of Lakota. My mother is. And of course, that's the kind of somewhat typical story in Indigenous communities when you have parents or grandparents who are fluent, but that just didn't quite pass down completely. I think when my family was growing up and we were kids, our mother used Lakota a lot with us. But you just, when you're young and English is the primary mode of communication in schools, with other family members, with your friends, you kind of start to, she would speak to us in Lakota and we'd respond in English, and that also put a toll on her. eventually in sort of the push. So I know, like, I know when she's telling me to sit down and shut up. I know when she wants something. My pronunciation is pretty good and my understanding is pretty good, but my speaking is poor in terms of being able to communicate. I hope to change that in the years to come. But nonetheless, I thought this was like a normal expression that was used even during pre-contact times. And it turns out it's not. It's not an expression that was used prior to European contact. It's very much a product of the relationship now that we have with English. I asked my mom about that, because she's a fluent speaker, and an elder. And I was like, Mom, if we didn't say this, how did we greet each other? I want to know, I want to know how we used to greet each other. And she said, oh, well, you're a man, and how you would greet people is you would say, how? And I thought, really? You'd say how? She's like, yeah. And I was like, it was a little moment of identity crisis for me. Because I was like, what else was Peter Pan right about? Right? It was really, this word is not traditional. And I was like, holy cow, we said how? Did we also say Hana Managanda? Of course we didn't. But it was a moment of, here I'm hearing this expression that is, quote unquote, traditional, right? Even though we'll talk more about that word and the different nuances of that word. This is a phrase, an expression that has been parodied throughout sort of American culture, from the Wild West into today, into canonical Disney movies. And it's an expression that when I heard, oh really, we would say how, as a man, I would say how, and that's what the gesture that would come with it, and she was like, yeah. Now, we don't do that anymore, because, well, it's kind of obvious why we don't do it anymore. Because this is what people think of, and there's lots of parody around that kind of expression. And so it's fallen out of use, right? So this speaks to, I think, this relationship that we've heard a lot about yesterday, of course, from the linguistic perspective, this idea of tradition and evolution, right? Ihani Washite is an evolution of the language and how we now greet each other, though it is not, quote unquote, traditional. And this is where I have my biggest interest in Indigenous education. I've looked at, in my own work, on how schooling looks at, addresses, and understands the quote-unquote Indian problem, Indian issue, right? Because it's still something we have to deal with, about what do we mean when we teach Indigenous students? What does that mean? How does it change from teaching non-Indigenous students? What's the new factor, right? And so that's a question that has very much interested me. And this paradigm shows up over and over and over again. In fact, it showed up yesterday, which was always fascinating to me when it shows up in these kinds of contexts. And it always comes in this phrase, right? That somehow Indigenous people are living this paradigm that we often refer to as walking in two worlds, right? That there is a traditional world, or an Indigenous world, and then there's some other world, loosely defined, or sometimes very explicitly defined, but not the only way. So it can be evolution, it can be, is it the dominant society that they have to walk in sometimes? Or is it white culture? Or is that the same thing? American, is that the same thing as white and dominant? European, modernity? Ooh, that's a really tough word to put in there too. But this is really undefined, right? What does it mean to walk in two worlds that have these different connotations? Connotations dependent upon and changing with the different contexts. This is, of course, very questionable, but the other side is often less questioned. And when we talk about tradition, we have to talk about who defines that. Who gets to say what is traditional? And who has the authority? Do we reach to elders? Do we reach to historical text? All these things have challenges, right? Roadblocks. What do we mean when we talk about purity? That's another thing that came up in yesterday's conference, right? Issues of purity, of linguistic purity, of cultural purity. Let's not even get into issues of blood, quantum impurity, although that is a continued part of this conversation. And to what extent is how we define tradition limiting, right? Can tradition end up becoming a way in which Indigenous education can be sort of throttled and limited? These are the questions I was super interested in asking when it comes to how schools approach Indigenous education, approach the teaching of and the acculturating of, because let's face it, that's what schools do and they can't help it. Schools acculturate students. So I looked to the state of the world's Indigenous peoples. This was a big report from the United Nations body, from the, of course, the Permanent Secretariat on Indigenous Peoples Issues. Did this big major study on all kinds of areas about what is the state of the world's Indigenous peoples. This was back in 2010. And they said a lot. They said a lot about the state of the world's Indigenous peoples. Mostly it was that the state of the world's Indigenous peoples is pretty dismal. And when it came to education, they laid out, obviously the many barriers that Indigenous students across the world face when it comes to education. But when they recommended what needs to be done, I feel like this was the best summed up quote. They said, students need skills and knowledge to enable them to work in Indigenous and non-Indigenous contexts and economies, right? Economies and contexts. And to me, it's probably the most blatant statement of truth in this report. Sort of speaks to that old moniker of, Indigenous students have to be Indigenous, whatever that means, and they have to be successful in non-Indigenous contexts. They have to do it both, they have to do it all, right? There's more work, there's twice the work. And to me, I say we take that and take it to its fullest extent. What does that mean then for education, for teachers, for schools, and to face the reality, right? Here's what we know from educational data, right? Big data from the Department of Education and their latest numbers. We know that Native American / American Indian, I purposely use both, students in the United States still have the highest dropout rate of any census group in the entire country, right? And we know that actually, according to the most recent educational census data, that went down, right? Every other census group's graduation rates have gone up, except Native American students. They went down in their graduation rates. Not by much, but it's hovering at 50%, right? 50% of self-identified Indigenous students do not graduate high school, right? This is high school dropout rate. We also know that a majority of Native American and American Indian students are really not in Indigenous exclusive schools. They're more integrated into public schools that serve predominantly white or other mixed demographic bodies, right? So there actually are very few, percentage-wise, American Indian students being served in tribal schools, in Bureau of Indian Education schools, or in other private schools that might serve American Indian students in and off of reservations. We also know that reservations sorely lack in schools for the amount of young people they have, and thus we actually have this problem where, especially on reservations where there's higher risk for poverty, that there are students who just aren't in school, right? And there's serious truancy deficits there. We also know that a majority of teachers who serve Native American and American Indian students are non-Indigenous, right? This is especially true in the schools off reservation, but even on Indigenous reservations in the United States and probably in Canada, teachers are primarily non-Indigenous, right? And if they do have Indigenous teachers, those teachers are typically teaching language, interestingly enough. So that is what we know from data, right? What we know from research. What do we do about that, right? What does educational research tell us about how we address the achievement gap, right? And really, to sum up from the research about the Native American achievement gap, the American Indian achievement gap, two big things emerge across lots of different studies. The first one is always kind of like the most obvious to me, but it's something that is, despite its obviousness, really powerfully ignored often in the conversation, ignored in a very interesting way, and that's rigor. Native American students need rigor. Well, we have to talk about what that means, and we have to talk about why aren't they getting rigor, right? What is happening there? And the other thing that studies show and say and talk often about is Native American students need culture, right? There's a lack of culture when Native American students do not see themselves and their communities reflected in the school and in the curriculum and in the environment. They're less likely to engage, right? Or just see themselves as being important or having that identity confirmed, right? Often that's where it's left, right? Just these two ideas, right? This is what needs to happen. Now educators make it happen. There's strong reasons why these two things, despite being what is said to be the most working, these are the ideas that work to close that achievement gap, there's challenges to that. In the rigor, right? Students are still being taught by teachers who suffer from a deficit mentality, right? The idea that students are coming into the classroom and maybe they weren't fed that morning, or maybe they're living in a home where there's alcoholism or domestic violence, or and therefore, because of all these problems that are outside of me, the teacher's control, I really can't be rigorous with them, right? That's the idea, right? That's the idea behind the deficit mentality towards Native American students. There's still a strong pervasiveness of teachers dealing with American Indian students, Native American students, in a way that is, that does not add rigor. And in fact, rigor is seen as rigor is seen as, in fact, something that's going to harm American Indian students. I can't be rigorous with them. Don't you realize that they're coming in not ready? And so I need to remediate. And so often teachers are sitting in the remediation space and never moving from that space, right? And thus students, Native American students, are not getting grade level content. They're not being pushed to higher expectations because the expectations are already determined to be low, right? The expectations are already set low, and therefore the students are not asked to achieve at a higher bar, and therefore they won't, right? If they're not asked to do so. The culture issue. The culture issue is a bit larger than that, right? We have to go back to that two worlds conundrum. The two worlds conundrum does a couple of things, right? It paints tradition, it paints indigenous culture as being in opposition to something, right? Being in opposition to some undefined, amorphous, dominance, right? And that to therefore be indigenous is to not be those other things, right? And that to be indigenous is to be something else. And students, interestingly enough, I think in the work I've looked at, the work I've done, they're really not asked these questions in a way that helps them understand what it even means to be engaged in a cultural conversation, what it means to think about their own culture. Because really it's about identity, right? Language is about identity. Tradition is about identity. And we don't ask enough of our students and of ourselves in indigenous communities, what does it mean to be an indigenous person? And what does it mean to belong to an indigenous community? What is that? What makes it different from being non-indigenous? What's the core of that identity? What's the issue? I teach a class. I teach high school students a Native American history class. I focus solely on Lakota history because there's a lot there. And there's a lot to talk about. So we do sort of, the big history pieces. We look at what was life like pre-contact, what was life like during early initial contact, and that's super important because students' narrative of their own history is often really, really negative, and that's completely understandable. The history of an indigenous person is often, if not always, just inextricably linked to genocide, and that's deplorable. And it's something Native students have to deal with, understand, and think about. But I think it's so important for the Lakota context to talk about early contact, because that's that really interesting bubble where there was somewhat of an equal exchange between two new peoples who are meeting each other for the first time. When Lakota people are readily accepting metal pots and pans and guns and beating, and they're trading their goods, and they're enjoying this cultural exchange. They're intermarrying with these early westward migrants, and we talk about that to be like, how is this different from then what happens next, right? The inevitable Indian War era. Skipping over all that, we eventually get to the point of talking about this question. What does it mean to be Lakota? What does it mean to be American Indian? What does it mean to be Native American? Are those different things? Why do those two terms exist? What do you think about these two terms existing? And then throwing in indigenous in there also, like another curveball. What does that mean? And it's fascinating. It's fascinating every single year when I teach this course with my high school students from my reservation, from my own community, to hear what they think about what it means to be indigenous. Blood quantum comes up way more than I ever thought it would, even for this younger generation, right? Yeah, to be Indian, you need to be a certain blood quantum. They readily kind of talk about that and accept that that's a given. Language, right? They tend not to associate language with being indigenous because they recognize that not many people speak it, right? We're better than Klingon. We have more speakers than Klingon does. I'm thankful for it, but that's a product of history. But nonetheless, there's a lot of native Lakota speakers. There's still a lot of fluent speakers, somewhere around the lines of 3,000. And we have also a lot of second language learners. We're doing pretty well when it comes to an indigenous community working to revitalize their language. And yet students somewhat take that for granted, right? Which I find really fascinating. Another thing that students talk about is that really warms me is a sense of responsibility, right? And that's ultimately what I hope my students walk away with from that course, is that being Indigenous can be a lot of things. Being American Indian can be a lot of things. It can be a lot of things that you make for yourself in terms of how you want to define and shape your identity. But at the end of the day, being Indigenous is a responsibility, right? And that really warms me when students realize and understand and start to speak in a way that reflects that. I look at Mount Rushmore as a great example of that. Mount Rushmore is, the famous carving of the 4 presidents in the Black Hills. The Black Hills are a very sacred place for the Lakota. For our students, every year we go back to the Black Hills to welcome back the Thunder Beings. In fact, that's what students are doing, I think, today. We talked about Mount Rushmore in the context of identity. And I talked to the students about, when we look at those 4 presidents' faces, right, carved into our sacred mountains, and we know that those 4 presidents did not have a positive view of American Indian people, to say the least. What we take away from that is not anger necessarily. It's not bitterness. What we should take away from that experience and from that reminder every day is the responsibility to be Indian, the responsibility to be Indigenous. That it is in many ways, a privilege and a gift to pass on to next generations, right? To define for yourself. Typically not the way Indigenous identity is talked about as a privilege, but that's what we try to do. And that leads me to the role of schools, right? Schools have been, for better or worse, been the place where the responsibility to communicate Indigenous identity has been thrust, right? Less and less, I feel, tribes have asked their schools, right? Tribes have asked their schools to be the place where Indigenous identity is workshopped, right? But without really much guidance. That's the unfortunate part. Without really much guidance. And that's kind of where I, again, have really great interest. Schools have to be really careful about how they do this. I don't know if schools have been as careful, and there's lots of reasons why they haven't been as careful. We can look back to the statistics and the ideas brought up earlier. Most schools that teach Indigenous students are not made up of Indigenous people. We ask a lot of our non-Indigenous educators to be a voice interested enough on what it means to teach Indigenous students. We could do better at preparing them because that's a reality we're going to have for a while, right? No time soon are we going to be in a situation where Indigenous educators are the majority, right? So we have work to do on preparing our non-Indigenous educators to be to do that better. I like this book, Making Indigenous Citizens, by Maria Elena Garcia. I was really thankful that yesterday we had a speaker here, Nate, who was talking about Quechua in Ecuador and how that's kind of happening, and the way in which Indigenous groups are responding to that. This book by Maria Elena Garcia, I like to use an example of the role of schools because in this book, Maria Elena Garcia is looking at the country of Peru. She's looking at the government and NGO initiatives in Peru. And what Peru was doing, this is back in 2010 that this was written, what Peru was doing was they were pushing this idea of bilingual, bicultural education. So that from the state, there was this push that from early grades, from kindergarten through roughly 5th grade, we want more Quechua and Aymara speaking teachers, and we want the language of instruction to be in Quechua Aymara because the statistics show that when students are taught in their native language first, in their mother tongue first, and then transition to Spanish, they do better, right? This was not the thing that parents wanted, though, and Nate talked a little about this yesterday, because it was true also in Ecuador. Parents and community members felt this was not acceptable, right? That what they wanted was schools to teach Spanish, and this was their reason why. One parent was quoted as saying, you say that we are a bilingual and intercultural country, but we are not, we're a racist country. And it's your responsibility to teach our students Spanish, because that's how they're going to achieve, right? If our students don't have Spanish, then they're not going to achieve, and you're forcing our own language on us. We'll teach that at home, right? It's your job to prepare my student for the future, and that future is Spanish. It was a really interesting book. If you're very interested, I definitely recommend reading it. It's a very interesting conundrum on indigenous language teaching and how it operates in schools. But this was interesting to me because it's a very different narrative than here in the United States, right? Here in the United States, we want schools to do more when it comes to indigenous language, right? Because it's a moral imperative, right? It's a moral imperative to save our languages from extinction. It's a moral imperative to put more culture into the school system. But we have to ask those questions. Are schools prepared for that? How do schools do that? How do schools frame the way they teach culture, especially as it's tied to language and other forms of cultural practice? And to what extent do schools also then have the responsibility to prepare students to, as the State of the World's Indigenous Peoples put it, to succeed in both indigenous and non-indigenous contexts, right? It goes back to that idea of we do have to do it all, right? And how do we do that? I'll give you a brief example of how we do our language teaching at Red Cloud. So we work with Indiana University. Indiana University established this orthography, this way of writing Lakota. It includes sounds that, of course, don't exist in the regular English lexicon, so we needed to create symbols for that. This is not the first orthography that's ever been written about Lakota. In fact, there's so many. I just listed a few others. There's also Takini, there's Bucol, which he was a priest who wrote the first Bible in Dakota, and he needed some way of indicating those sounds. Riggs, Manhart, and there's more. There's so many other ways that Lakota can be written. We chose this way to write it because, again, we're working with Indiana University, working with linguists, wanted to find, we know that we're always going to have limitations around fluent speakers. Fluent speakers being successful teachers, fluent speakers in their age, being able to be regular teachers in the classroom, especially at that young elementary age. So we needed an orthography that if you were not a native speaker and there was no native speaker available to you, if you at least knew the sounds of these alphabet, could you speak and it sounds correct, right? And so that's what this came out to be. Interestingly enough, this is still a huge debate in our tribe. The tribe does not recognize an official orthography, and they refuse to. In fact, our tribal college, Oglala Lakota College, their whole language department, as a department, decided that they will not endorse any particular orthography because their strong belief is that the Lakota language is an oral language and therefore it should not be written, and we don't care about how we write it, and therefore when we teach it, any instructors can write it down however they want to. And that's not important. What's important is that they're speaking and that they're communicating. I get that. Red Cloud, we decided we want to have a written orthography. And the results have been really fascinating. Our students are a generation of social media users. they're Facebooking each other in Lakota. They're posting on Lakota. They're Snapchatting each other using the text because you can download it onto your phone. And they're using Lakota in new and innovative ways, right? That's, to me, Indigenous identity, right? In action, right? And they're using their language in new and interesting ways. It's not spoken in those contexts. But that does not mean that our students are not engaging in that really powerful communication. And this is something we're hoping to continue to do and do better. Just last week, one of our students went viral because they sang the national anthem in Lakota at the state South Dakota basketball championship. And someone recorded it, and USA Today posted it, and that was really exciting. We're very proud of him. Our students regularly do their valedictorian speeches at graduation in Lakota because they've had years to now perfect and utilize it. Our students aren't leaving fluent, but they're leaving communicators. And that's exactly what we want. So when schools implement culture, there's a number of things that they have to consider. It needs to be open-ended, and it needs to be growth-oriented. All right, we can't think of culture as being restriction. We have to think of culture as being empowering, right? There has to be multiple elder voices. There can't just be one, right? There actually must be elder and youth communication, and it must be reciprocal, right? More and more we see, even amongst young people, this notion of we have to be deferential to elders, and yes, that's custom. Yes, that's tradition. Elders could do themselves a favor by hearing youth, and we want to create a space for that. We must ask questions about identity. We can't leave it up to chance. We have to ask real clear and compelling questions about what does it mean, and have students engage in those questions. And finally, we must be intentional about how we frame cultural teaching, right? We must be intentional about what message we're sending. Because in Indigenous schools, in programs that push culture onto students, some of them accept it, and some of them find joy and nourishment in it, and others reject it because it's been prescribed to them in a way that is not open-ended, right? And we see that a lot in schools where there's assumptions made about culture, about students, where they're from. When it comes to culture, the rule still applies to when it comes to any other type of teaching, in any other subject. We have to meet students where they are. So, that's it. I'll take questions. Yes?
Talking about that phrase, walking in two worlds, and reflecting on the feelings of the community there in Peru, which is so common in the other Indigenous communities, about wanting the children to learn the dominant language rather than their own language, or support their own language. There's a difference between learning a language and continuing support, but I think of it more of, it's not a question of walking in two worlds, it's that the language is being relegated to only certain spheres.
Mm-hmm.
And they recognize, these parents recognize that their language is not being used in the sphere of commerce. It's not the language of commerce. It's not the language of government. It's not even the language of recreation, pop culture. And that's why they are so focused on this idea, but I want my child to be able to fit in and move beyond our world. But it's not really a world, it's just a question of sphere and domain. Now do you foresee ever Lakota, being more specific in your community, the language returning to those spheres? Because in my Pueblo culture, we have dual government. We have traditional government, and then we have the formal government that deals with the outside world. And very much so, our language is still a language in the sphere of government and commerce within that context. do you see Lakota being used in tribal government and commerce?
I believe it should be. I believe it should be, and I think in speaking to the idea of spheres and through spheres of influence, I think that's exactly why language should be allowed to sort of flourish and prosper under its own terms, and especially under the terms of youth. I think as our young people start to continue to use Lakota in really fascinating ways that sort of challenge the status quo. A lot of our students who go off to college they like to text each other and speak to each other in Lakota because it's like nobody else understands us, right? They Snapchat each other in Lakota, they're singing the national anthem in Lakota, they're producing rap music in Lakota. And to me, that's how Lakota will gain a sphere of influence, right? Because yes, I think when language is sort of encased and sort of relegated to a sphere of non-influence, even under the auspices of tradition, which can again be a limiting factor, that's when a language will continue to be relegated outside of that sphere of influence. Yeah.
How many Lakota people speak Klingon?
As far as I know.
Can you talk about the emphasis of language and culture in early childhood education? I guess particularly, right, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, early childhood is an area, Red Cloud doesn't actually have any pre-K,
Right.
but we do work with the Lakota Immersion Daycare.
Right.
And again, those students are now transitioning to us in kindergarten under still an immersion program. And there, it is primarily about communication. For so long, Lakota language study was about let's learn animals, let's learn colors, let's learn numbers. And so we're trying to be much more immersive. And that's actually been, we've had to make some really tough decisions around the decisions that some people in our community don't necessarily agree with. We have to come up with words like for laptop and for cell phone and for words that we didn't have those for. And the immersion program now is working on how do we teach math and science in Lakota, and we have to come up with words for that. And they're using the Hawaiian nest model, and they've gone there and visited them to sort of look at that. It's a tough job, and you have to have multiple fluent speakers together to make those kinds of decisions, but a decision has to be made nonetheless, right? And so, yeah, I think we've been pretty forward-thinking in terms of making those decisions. I think others would hesitate for fear of community, ostracization or just overall, what's the word? Just criticism. But we have a goal, and we want students to be speakers.
Can I follow up to
Yeah.
this question? This is more of a comment, but I think we have to realize that language teaching a language should not be divorced from the culture. Your curriculum, to be successful, really needs to be culturally based, culturally relevant. And for example, in my pueblo, Isleta del Sur Pueblo, our curriculum, for example, is really centered on the cycle of the seasons, our ceremonies that follow the changing of the seasons. That's one thing. Because like getting back to the that's just a word-for-word literal transference of an English language convention, cultural context, and supplanting it with Lakota, but forgetting the whole cultural context. In my language, we don't say good morning. What we're asking you is, how is your dawn, your daylight going? For plural, how is your day? And the answer would be good, bad, or whatever. And always say Hawaii. And yours? How is yours? So shorthand, when we greet each other, a lot of times we'll just say Hawaii, Hawaii. And it really means and yours, and yours. And the kids think that we're saying Hawaii, saying good morning, that Hawaii correlates to good morning, when it does not. And so when we're promoting this preservation of the language, we can't forget the cultural component. And I love to hear how the older folks express themselves, and then when you back translate it to English, and you see how beautiful and poetic it even sounds to me, if they describe snowfall as the snow is kissing the Mother Earth, or blanketing the Mother. You see, it's not just snow fell. You know, they have very
Yeah, culture is inextricably linked with the language. What I will say is that we do try and be relevant also. I think what we've seen in the past with language teaching is that there was this idea of, okay, language needs to be linked with culture, and the culture is this, so we've got to teach kids all, for example, let's teach kids, like, what's an example? Let's look at what a traditional village was like, and let's label everything, right? Lakota. That's important, but it was limited to that, right? So students were getting that, and they should, but they weren't getting how do we talk about our own life every day, right? And therefore, there was this idea that like tradition and culture was this historic thing. They were getting historic language, but they weren't getting language that was relevant today. And my feeling is they need both, because they need to have the tools and the skills and the knowledge to succeed in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous contexts.
While you're using community-based schooling, what I mean by that is that school and home are not these two separate places. You know, too often Indian families think, okay, we have our home life and then we're going to send you off to this other place, school. Whereas community-based is when the community really mixes in with school. They're not so, there's not a dichotomy. Do you use that at Lakota?
I think so. I think we're trying to build more of that community-based context. That what our students learn through their language is relevant to their daily lives, relevant to their families. We also do an adult night of language learning every Wednesday night. Parents can come in and get some of what their kids are getting, and so that they have shared dialogue, because we have families, plenty of families, who don't have fluent elders in the home. And so we totally need that whole holistic system of our students are getting it and adults are getting it too. And we're hoping to keep expanding that. Yeah. It's time. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I don't know if it's appropriate to ask, but I would really love to hear the alphabet spoken, so that my...
I'll tell you so I'll give you an idea of the different marks. Notice that we have a regular K, a KH, and a KH, we call it H wedge. So the K and the KH is just aspirated and unaspirated, right? And the KH, the H wedge in general, is a sound that we don't have in English. It's the sound. So the KH is H, the G wedge is H, the PH wedge is H, TH wedge H. So all the wedges with an H have that, or even just the wedges in general have that sound. C wedge is ch, and then the apostrophe is what we use for a plosive. So o, and then the N with a little curve is the nasalized. Yeah. So yeah, no problem. O and Z wedge is sh. Any other questions?
I just have one real quick question.
Yeah.
Lakota, I imagine it's huge. In the different areas, is there different pronunciations of words that maybe, like when you say good morning, like one area might say it a little bit different than the other? Is there different branches? Like, because I know in ours, depending on what area they lived, there are some variations in the words. Is there a lot in yours?
Yeah, it's all very mutually intelligible, but Lakota and Dakota are essentially the same language, and they're mutually intelligible, but they're just called D dialect speakers versus L dialect speakers. And so Dakota was through Minnesota and that little region. There's a language family in between, geographically in between Dakota and Lakota, that they used to call Nakota sometimes. You'll see that in some literature. That led people to think that they spoke with an N-based dialect. That wasn't true. They just speak a mixture of the two. So that was not a very good label. But even amongst L speakers, on my reservation, the guttural sound, the is really strong. It really is hyper pronounced. But if you go up to say Standing Rock, it's very soft, and they do just really simple, very. It's very light. It's not as pronounced. So that's an example. But yeah, there's expressions on the different reservations that are different, but all very mutually intelligible.